Hi, I'm Sheila Kuehl, and you're watching, or you're about to watch, Get Used to It. Every so often we interview an individual whose life has made a real impact on not just our community, but our world. And today we have a really special treat for you. It's the Reverend Troy Perry. He's the founding bishop of the Metropolitan Community Church. And if you think that sounds kind of either narrow or uninteresting or whatever, wait until you see this interview. I'm so happy that he's here joining us today. He only had the time to talk to us because he's retired, which means that he's only working 23 hours a day. Troy, so happy that you're here. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Sheila. It's wonderful to be here with you.
Thank you. It's great to have you here. We hear so much these days about faith-based organizations, about people of faith. We certainly have heard it from the national government ad nauseum, and everybody. And I think this is an issue that everyone in the country is taking very seriously. On the positive side, spirituality, the need for connection to a higher power or God within or whatever. But on the negative side, our community has suffered so much, really, from some aspects of people who refer to themselves as people of faith. So I think that the story of your life, if we can unfold it kind of here for the viewers, would be, I think, not only of great interest, but of great inspiration. You certainly have always been an inspiration to me. So if you don't mind, could we kind of go back to the very beginning? Where were you born, and what was your childhood like? Where was it, your family, etc.?
I was born in Tallahassee, Florida, the capital, North Florida, where the old families live, as they used to say. My parents, I remember, I'm the oldest of 5 boys in my family, and I had wonderful parents. I loved my mother and I loved my father, and we had a small community. Tallahassee, when I was a little boy, was 10,000 people. Today, of course, it's 500,000 without blinking an eye and still growing. But I went to I went to grammar school there, and part of my junior high years there, my father was killed in a car wreck when I was 12 years old, and it was very interesting. I'm one of those people who live an interesting life in that I didn't know what my father did for a living. I knew that we owned a wonderful home. I knew that we owned a 168-acre farm. I knew that he had gas stations. He owned a large portion of the African-American ghetto. It was called Frenchtown in Tallahassee. And my father had as many African-American friends as he did white friends. I mean, it was always amazing to me. But when you wake up and your dad is killed in a car wreck, and of course the Tallahassee Democrat, the newspaper, comes out and tells you that your dad was the biggest bootlegger in all of North Florida. He was being chased by the police when he was killed.
I'm sorry.
No, that's all right. No, I can joke about the son of the bootlegger part too.
Well, I'd say you either come a long way or not.
Oh, yeah, right. I've come a long way. But it was amazing to me. My dad, when he died, it became very rough for the family in that my father left my mother well off. But my mother was born on the farm. She hated the farm. Dad couldn't wait to get back to the farm. He had never really lived on a farm. So they moved back for 6 months until one day he's out building a fence, and he's got the axe in his hand, and my mother tells the story of he got a piece of wood stuck through his hand, had to get on a tractor, and drive into the little town, the closest little town, Jasper, Florida.
That was just too far away for her.
And it was she wanted to be back in Tallahassee, the big city, compared to where she had come from. And I remember them telling the story. My father, this cured him when he went, he was not used to this, and he was on the tractor, drove the tractor into the little town. It took him 30 minutes to get there with this board sticking through his hand. And when he arrived there, typical of my father, the doctor came. I can laugh today as I think about things in my life, but my dad, when he walked up, the doctor knocked on the door, and the doctor said, "What's wrong?" And he said, "Well, I've got this stick through my hand." And the doctor took one look and said, "Well, I don't open for 15 minutes. And my father, being my father, jerked open the door and said, "You just opened." And so it got them back to Tallahassee, and it was there that I was born, and I was thrilled. It was a friendly town, a southern town. It was also there that I always tell people that I had my first sexual experiences with other Southern boys my age in Tallahassee, and where I really came to terms with I was different. And I didn't know what all that meant at that time, but I was different and I knew that.
Now, what time of the century are we talking about here?
We're talking about the 40s. I was born in, July the 27th, 1940, and for Californians, I'm a Leo. I always cut up and tell people, they said, yeah, we can tell, But it was that time period, and it was different. I didn't see my first television until 1953, and that was in Tallahassee, and my God, the first time I saw one, we didn't even have a TV station. Jacksonville would sort of drift in.
Troy, I was on television before we owned a television.
No,
I mean, the same thing, early 50s.
Same thing.
So times were very different.
They
but
were.
Now, was your family a religious family?
It was very, very interesting. They were and they weren't. Mother was a good Baptist who went to church when she was home visiting her mother and dad. It was typical of the time that they would go sporadically. My father only went to church probably once or twice a year, and he was his relatives were all Pentecostals. So we cut up and said that was a mixed marriage in the South, because Baptists and Pentecostals just didn't always get along. And so my father's funeral was held in the Pentecostal church in Tallahassee when he died.
Now, I know when you were very, very young, you started preaching. So how does a young man or a young boy actually, from a family that you would characterize as enormously religious, how do you even begin to get an interest in preaching?
Sheila, I loved church. I was one of those kids that won all kind of prizes in the Baptist church for our sword drills, we call them. They loved me. And I was one of those kids that took very seriously Sunday school, those sorts of things. And I went without my parents. I just liked to go to church. And they didn't, of course, they never tried to stop me or anything from going. They loved that I wanted to go to church. And my Uncle Roy, my father's, I'm Troy Jr., and my father, Troy Sr., his brother, Troy and Roy. Roy was the baby. And my Uncle Roy, as in the Baptist tradition, he had a conversion experience. And my uncle was not the nicest man in the world. But when he had this experience, it really affected me. I just knew. I knew my uncle before this happened, and then my uncle afterwards. And my uncle, because I loved church, when I'd go visit them on my father's farm, but they were the sharecroppers on the farm, I would go to church with him as a Baptist minister, and he pastored these 3 little tiny Baptist churches. And I found out more about ministry from my uncle. It was hysterical, some of the stuff. I remember going once with him to this one little Baptist church, and he was preaching one of the 3, and only 3 women came to church that morning. And I remember that he got the offering. That was the way he was paid. And when he opened the envelope out in the car, I will never forget my uncle said, he looked in and there was just 75 cents in the envelope. And he said, if these sapsuckers can't do better than this, I'm not going to come over here again. Like that. I'll always remember it as long as I live.
So clearly you weren't getting into it for the money.
No, I wasn't. No. Because I didn't even know you got paid until I tell people at age 13 after my father died. It was really interesting. My mother remarried, but going to my uncle's farms before she remarried, I had a real experience where I had felt called to the ministry.
So is that? Say more about that. I mean, I know that you've, many times we describe our lives, but I'm interested if you can remember and identify it. What does that mean? How does that feel?
Mine was after a lot of prayer, and I know at age 13 people look and say, my God, what does a kid at 13 know? But sometimes you really do. I'm one of those people, I think, that I was a young boy with an old soul. I loved adults. I liked always to hang around with adults, hear adults talk. So, and because I loved church, that meant I was very open to listening to people and what they had to say. And I knew somehow God was dealing with me. And I explained to people, even though it's hard to when you're at that age, that I knew God had something special for me to do. When I told my Aunt Lizzie Smithy, these country names, I know people laugh to this day when I say it, but she helped found the snake handling churches in America. And she was a character. My mother was afraid of her. She didn't want me around this woman because she was afraid. They kept snakes around the house that they would take to church to handle. And she said to me, but my aunt said to me, she said, Troy Jr., she said, has the Lord been dealing with you? Very Southern. And I said, yes, ma'am. I said, I believe God's calling me to preach. She said, well, I want you to preach in my church next Sunday.
I was going to ask now, what is that moment in the movie, where Troy Jr. stands up, goes to the front, starts to preach? So he was invited by his aunt.
I was invited by my aunt. I have to, if it hadn't been for her. But she immediately said, I want you to preach at my church next Sunday. And this is very typical of Pentecostals. They were willing to let kids up in front of their congregations. They were not frightened by that. And they really gave them a lot of attention. So here I get ready to go preach the next Sunday. Now I'm really frightened. I'm going to be in front of people, and I'd been in front of people before in little school plays and things like that as a kid, but not really, and not where I was going to be front and center. And I remember that I took my Bible, walked into my Uncle Arthur and Aunt Sarah's cornfield, and I went in, I sat down, and I really came to terms with, okay, what am I going to say? What am I going to preach on? And I kept going to a scripture about the sower sowing the seeds in Christian scripture. And for some reason, that's where I felt like God had led me to that scripture, and that's what I was to preach on. And I was just awful that first Sunday. When I look back, I think how they even sat there with me. But they did. And when I first started, the Pentecostals, they talk back to you in service. They're like African-American churches they were when I was growing up. So they would say, amen me. And I thought, my God, I've hit pay dirt, and I haven't even got the scripture out of my mouth. So I kept repeating the scripture. But I finished that sermon, gave an altar call, as we called it in the Pentecostal church, for people to come forward to become believers, and 2 people came forward. And it was amazing. And I said, okay, I preached my first sermon. And it was like I had finally, just a taste of this made me want to do it more. And my aunt and uncle, who went to a different Pentecostal church, I preached there, and then the pastor there said, Troy, you need to just get out and preach. And so I said, where? He said, well, street corners. So I went into the little town of Adel, Georgia, took my 2 cousins, one who sang and one who played the guitar, and they would do the music and I would do the preaching, and we'd do a 15-minute service on a street corner in Adel. And I cut up, and that's when I learned you got paid to preach. I had a drunk who would come up and flip pennies at me, and I got all the pennies when it was over with. So I always told people that's where I found out preachers really got paid. I mean, this is it with Uncle Roy.
You had indicated to me that in Florida, you also had your first experiences as a gay man or a gay boy.
Yes.
Was this before I'm trying to get the sort of...
It was before my father died. I started having an experience when I was 9 years old with another young man who was about my age, maybe 2 years older. And he was a wonderful young man who went to the Adventist church, the Seventh-day Adventist church. His mother, they went to good schools. Later, a gay man in the Coast Guard and made a career out of it. And he was a wonderful, he had the biggest comic book collection in our neighborhood. And I love going to Delmer's house to look at comic books, but we had a sexual relationship too. And it was very funny. I said to him after our first experience, I didn't want him to do this with my other brothers. That I wanted to be special with us. Even at 9, I was pushy, and a Leo, and he really was. It was so special, and I didn't see him again till I got out of the military. And when I got out of the military, after I'd served term, which is a later story, but I ended up with going back through Tallahassee, and his mother called me and said, Delmer's here from the Coast Guard and he wants to see you. And I was 29 years old then, and as adults it was
let me
wonderful.
ask you though, at this stage in your life as a young teenager, what did you experience a conflict about this? I mean, it's here you are, not only are you a man or a boy who's been called by God to preach, but you're also having sexual experiences, and really we were always told, especially in those days, that it was just wrong.
Yes.
So did you have
I
any
had
concerns?
no guilt feelings about my homosexual relations until I was 16 years old. And I went to a youth camp, and at the youth camp something happened there. I and another boy were discovered having sex together. And that's when they came down on me so hard. For them, though, their attitude was as long as it was what it was masturbation, no more than that, then that was perfectly all right. But I had to get married. That's what they kept shoving me. Because they didn't believe there was a homosexual. They believed that you were a heterosexual who was doing something naughty. And something that you shouldn't be doing, but there was no such thing as a heterosexual in that church. They viewed it as not a lifestyle at all, but something that heterosexual men do sometimes.
And did you get married?
And I got married at age 18. Here I am preaching, and I'm already evangelizing, meaning that I'm being invited to churches to conduct revivals, but I couldn't pastor until I married. And I ended up with the daughter of my pastor. That a new pastor came to town, and when I saw his daughter, it was just incredible because I looked. She played the piano. Not only was she attractive, and not only was I attracted to her, but she was attracted to me too. All the young women in the church said, "Watch Troy Perry," and she said, "I discovered because they were all interested in Troy Perry." And she said, and when I saw her. In the Church of God, the denomination I was in, they paid a third more to pastors if your wife played the piano and she could conduct music. So it was really funny. So at age 18, she and I married, and we were just kids.
Well,
she was the first. I was a virgin. She was a virgin, as far as sex was concerned, between heterosexuals, and they didn't tell us what to do. I mean, there was no adult education, never told us what to do.
Right.
And for me, it was, what do you do? I tell people, she and I, we married, and yet these feelings wouldn't let me go, even though her father knew about it. I'd had a discussion with her dad. He had told her, but she was determined to marry me, and we did. And we had a good life together as much as we could, but it kept bothering me. I kept wrestling, what am I going to do? And finally, no matter what people tell you, there is no just this is going to go away.
Right.
It doesn't work like that in our lives. And so for me, it didn't go away.
So the marriage ended?
The marriage ended after 5 years. We moved to Southern California through a fluke. I was putting my way through Bible college, and until they threw me out when they discovered, when all of that happened, that I was gay. And so I ended up with the company I was working to put my way through school to pay for my schooling. It was a plastics firm, and they said we're opening a plant in Southern California, Torrance, California, and would you be willing to go out and help us open the plant? I said, well, I'm going to be in the ministry, and they said yes, but if you could go out there, you don't know how much we would appreciate it. And so my wife and I, we moved out. I was here when John Kennedy was killed. I was working at the plant. I remember it like it was yesterday.
Sure.
And I'm looking around. I'd written the bishop of the church that I had joined here, and the Church of God of Prophecy, and said, I'm Reverend Troy Perry, and I was licensed in Illinois, and here I am, and I wonder, is there a church, that I could preach in? And he contacted me and said, yes, there is, Reverend Perry. And he said, Santa Ana, California.
Wow.
He said, the pastor just had a stroke there, and I need someone to go in there. And I went in, and it was amazing. The Pentecostal church was very strict, but they loved me. I was the liberal pastor. The women did.
In Orange County.
In Orange County.
Right.
Because in the Church of God of Prophecy, women weren't supposed to wear shorts, or they weren't supposed to wear slacks. And it was just, to me, they majored in minors, I always said. And my women, one day we were going to paint the church, because, as we started growing, it was still largely women, and they loved me. And I said, we're going to paint the church, and I need you women to come help me. And the women said, sure. They said, well, how should we dress? I said, well, if you'll buy a pair of slacks, put on slacks so you're up on, nobody can say anything. They were thrilled. They'd never owned slacks in their lives. And they rushed out. Their pastor had given them permission to do that. And finally the day came when I walked into a bookstore in Santa Ana, California. And when I walked into the bookstore, it was just amazing. There was a magazine article that on television, they had mentioned it, and I wanted to quote from it in my sermon. And so I went into the bookstore, and that's where history was made for me, because when I went in, I went in to buy the magazine, but I ended up with something else too. And the first thing I did, I had never, this was not an adult bookstore, it was just a, it was a California bookstore, which means they carried things that surprised me. The first thing I did was picked up, I saw a physique magazine. And I tell people this when they were still wearing bathing suits. But I knew something in me said, what is this about this that just eats you alive? And then there was a book. Finally, I got up the nerve to walk up to the woman behind the counter. I know today she was probably a lesbian, but
could be.
I really mean this because I look back, I had nothing to compare it to then, but today I did. And I asked the woman, do you have anything on homosexuality? And she said, yes, I've got a few things. I said, well, could you give me a copy of whatever you've got? And she, when I got back, she put in 2 little novelettes, and while they turned me on, they didn't really teach me anything.
Right.
But there were 2 things in that bag that changed my life. One was a book called The Homosexual in America by Daniel Webster Corey, and the other one was a little magazine printed by the oldest homophile organization in America, One Incorporated.
You see, we have, although I don't think we can show it to our audiences, but
I
some of
do.
our set, maybe the wide shot,
I was
show that we
looking.
have these magazine covers.
Yes, I think it is incredible.
Yeah.
And one was when I read that, one let me know there was organized homosexuals, something I didn't believe. And it was just amazing to me when I read it. And there was a article in one of those One magazine articles later that just gave me a whole different perspective on scripture and homosexuality. It was written by a former nun who had joined One Incorporated and was a writer and read an article on homosexuality in the Bible, and it was incredible because it really pushed me to rethink what scripture said. But I'm still afraid. It's very, very bizarre, and yet I'm not, because when I get back to the parsonage and I read them, I hide the books. And then, of course, I start looking around. And the next thing I do is end up in bed with a man, and he was frightened. But he was a Marine. It was really, really interesting. And because he was frightened by me, because the next morning he tried the old trick of, I can't believe what happened last night.
Sure.
And I said, what you did. And I said, what I did, what we both did. And I just couldn't be shaken from that, because when I read those 2 magazines, that book, the next morning in the parsonage of my church where the pastor lives, I was shaving and broke down crying. Looked in the mirror, and for the first time in my life said out loud, Troy Perry, you're a homosexual. And I tell people that was my first born again experience outside of church. And that I made up my mind then and there. I'm gonna go talk to one of the officials of the church, let them know what I've discovered, and now I know I've got to get out of my marriage, and whatever else happens, I know what I am now, and I'm not going to lie about this anymore.
Well, it's interesting because in your life, of course, which we'll continue to talk about and see how you then took leadership and established at least this one organization, one of the greatest in the world, welcoming church. But interesting, I think, for people to understand that every person's life is a struggle. Every person's life to come out to themselves, and how frightening that moment is. I don't care if it's 2007 and we think it's very safe now. Somewhere, someone's watching thinking it's not safe where I am, and we know it's not.
That's true.
And I think it's really good for people to understand how difficult it is for every single person, even the one that they see as the most empowered, as the most, a professional gay person, as it were, and how it must be frightening even to look yourself in the mirror and say, this is who I am, because it's kind of like no going back on this one.
That's right. That's exactly, I tell people over and over again, that some folks, as we used to say in the early days, quickly move to a big city. We try to give a list of big cities. But it's not that simple. And as you said, where people will see this show, there will be somebody who's there who says, but you don't know my town. Well, I do. I've lived in those small towns. I know what it's like. Before I got to the big city, I knew what it was like. And you come out over and over again in different ways. It's just not once. It's the one time, for me, it really was that one time. I'm not going to lie about it anymore. But I still want to live, quote, as a good American. I come from the part of the country where, you know, families give their kids as fodder to the military. And they have ever since the Civil War. In the Civil War, that awful war where so many Americans died here, and I had relatives who died who fought for the South. And so all those stories were told to me as a kid, so I was well aware. But you know you've got to do it. You've got to come out to you, if not to anybody else. Right. Once you come out to you, you start feeling that empowerment. Oh, I tell people over and over again. Certainly I did. I didn't know what it would ensue. My mother, when my wife and I, once I had told our district overseer about me, he immediately said, oh, this is a trick of the devil. What makes you, have you molested some little boy in your Sunday school? I said, no, sir. He said, what makes you think you're a homosexual? Well, these books say I am, and I feel comfortable with what oh no, this is a trick of the devil. And he said, I had an experience like that too. Then he told me, had nothing to do with homosexuality, about his experience with a prostitute in France during World War II. I didn't know how it applied to me, but I was just all ears.
Just thought it was aberrant behavior.
Yes, that's the way he viewed it.
Right.
So I said, well, would you tell the bishop what I've told you? And 3 months, took the bishop about 3 months, 2 to 3 months before he came to Southern California. But the overseer told him, oh, by the way, Reverend Troy Perry came to see me and he thinks he's a homosexual. The bishop almost had a heart attack and he said, oh my God, if he thinks he is, he is. That was the bishop's attitude. And he said, I want him removed tonight. So he then came himself with 2 other clergy. That's what it took to excommunicate me from my church. My wife, when I get home, I'd been to the beach, and when I came home, my wife had got home, but she had some running around to do, so she said, you go to the beach. And they didn't believe in that either. So that was another thing. You don't go to you don't go to the beach where there's mixed bathing with women and men. That was another thing. And I thought that was just stupid law. I wasn't going to bed with women. I could assure them of that other than my wife. And so that part of it.
But going to the beach, that was a problem.
But going to the beach was a problem.
Right.
So I get back and immediately my wife said, the bishop's been here. Well, I knew what it was, and now it was the time. I was fixed to make this giant step in my life. And so she said, what is that about? And I said, well, I don't even know where to start. And about that time, he showed up. And I said, sweetheart, I said, I'll talk to you after this is over with. And I said, I'll tell you what it is. And so I went into the meeting. He asked me, he said, do you want me to tell you? I said, no, I don't need you. I'm an adult. I'll tell my wife. And then it frightened him. He didn't know what to do with me because I was not acting the way he wanted me to.
Right.
And
no shame.
No shame. And I said, he said, get up in front of the crowd and tell them you feel like you fell the Lord. And said, then you can leave. And I said, okay. And he said, don't use the word homosexual. I don't want to use that word tonight. I said, okay. And I knew it would be a lie. And I got up in front of my congregation. People started arriving. And I told my wife, we'll even go out to a coffee shop, get the kids ready as soon as this is over with, that I can go in and do this. And she still didn't know I was fixing to resign. I hadn't even told her yet. And I walked into the congregational meeting. Here were my good members. And 15 minutes after I left, after I did what he said, they verbally had the bishop backed up into a corner. They said, until he finally used the word homosexual to describe my behavior, and everybody it just sucked the air out of the room.
Sure.
And then nobody said, but before that they were saying, he and his family, this church has tripled since he's got here. We've raised money. He's fixing to build a church here. And what is this all about? And I left, took my wife, we went to a coffee shop. And it was at the coffee shop, I said, I don't know where to start. And she says, does it have anything to do with those books you found, in between the mattresses? And I found between the mattresses and cleaning the house. And I said, yes, it does. And she said, I read those books. And it says there are some homosexual men who are married heterosexually, and maybe we could work something out. And I said, you couldn't live that way, and I couldn't either. I said, I have to know who I am.
But Troy, you said an interesting thing, too, among all these interesting things, about also wanting to feel like you were still a real American.
Yes.
And you mentioned military service in your family and a tradition in the South. And I know you did go into the service.
That's correct.
Shortly after this,
yes,
right?
after she and I separated, her parents didn't want her to come back out to me. And we kept talking back and forth, but I was busy. I was finding myself, and finally I said, I just can't come. I said, that's all there is to it. And so we ended up in a situation where I received a letter from my dry board in Mobile, Alabama. Is it true that you and your wife are no longer together and you're no longer pastoring? See, during the Vietnam era,
right, exactly.
2 exemptions, and mine was 4D, the clergy classification.
You lost them both at one fell swoop there.
One fell swoop. And they said, I wrote them back and said, well, I pay support for the kids. And they wrote me back and said, no, Uncle Sam will take care of that. We need you. And I was drafted into the military 3 months before my 26th birthday when they couldn't have taken me in. And I went in the military, served without any problems whatsoever, openly gay. I would not back off from that if somebody asked. I didn't go around all day long saying I'm a gay person, but I wouldn't back away, and I would always be honest. Even in joking, I always said, the GIs would say to me, let's go to town and pick up some women. I said, if she has a brother, like that. I always said that to them. And then the GIs would talk about it. I found out years later, and people who were stationed there with me who are still friends. And they said that it was amazing. They said, you were talked about, but said no one ever believed it. They said because he cuts up and he has this sense of humor, and said he's always got to come back with everybody, and said all you've seen them, those young prostitutes in the town Kaiserslautern, Germany, where we're stationed, they love him. They're all over him. Said he has women. There's no GI on this base that has women. Well, they didn't realize the women were taking their breaks in a gay bar, and I got to know every one of them.
It's a nice, safe place for them to be.
It was a nice, safe place. They were not hit on.
But let me make sure that I leave a lot of time, or at least certainly sufficient time, to talk about the founding of the church, because of course all of that is incredibly important and interesting too. So let me see if I can lead you from getting out of the military, and then what connects then to your decision to found this incredible organization?
I came back home and tried to find a church to attend. I still was a deeply spiritual person. I like to say I'm not very religious sometimes, but I'm spiritual. And I can be I'm one of those preachers that I totally agree with people who say sometimes the Christian church, some aspects of it is too pushy. And I'm the first one to say that. And I say, I don't want to have people come into my church because I'm preaching hell. I want to give people heaven. And there's a difference. And I believe in a positive gospel, not some negative gospel, that every little thing you do is going to send you to hell. I don't believe that. It's hard to go to hell, I tell people. I said, you got to really work on going to hell, and you got to want to do it. And I said, it's not easy to go to hell, not like the Christian church has taught in the past. And so for me, 2 things happen. I come back from the military, fall deeply, madly in love with a man for the first time in my life. 6 months later, he walked out of my life, and it wasn't fair. I'd still even though I knew I was gay, this thing about God and religion and my parents, I couldn't find a church to go to because I was too honest. My mother said, why do you have to tell everybody you're homosexual? I said, because they asked, and I'm not going to ever lie again in my life about this. And so at church, it would always come up by the 3rd Sunday, and I'd be frozen out of the group. And with this young man, after he walked out of my life, again, I walked into a restroom, was shaving, broke down. I'm sure it was the closest thing to a nervous breakdown I'd ever had. I was just in love with him. And he said, but you're the most domineering individual I've ever met. And I said, no, I'm not domineering. He said, well, let me go out without you. And I said, but I like to be with you. I want to be with you. No, I can't live like this. And he was a fine young man, and but he walked out of my life. And as I was shaving, I broke down just crying and said, I don't have anything to live for. God, I can't talk to God. God hates me. The church hates me. My mom and dad, when I try to talk to them, my stepfather keeps telling my mother, he's not a homosexual. He doesn't dress in dresses. That was his version of a homosexual.
Sure.
And so when I cut both of my wrists. My ex-partner and my roommate came into the house when they heard water running in the bathroom, and I didn't answer. They broke down the door, and I was in the tub, almost unconscious. I mean, I was just very weak. Got tourniquets on my arms, got me into clothes, and rushed me to County General Hospital. Neighbors next door came running over to help them. And when I got into County General Hospital, something sparked my spiritual life really again. Even though I had my spirituality, I just didn't realize,
well, sometimes when a bad thing happens, we think it must be a punishment. I mean, it's interesting to be a religious or a spiritual person, because if you believe in God, there's a lot of tension about whether God's making stuff happen to you.
Yes.
And here this young man walked out of your life, and it must have made you think,
well, it was all so mixed up. Everything's abandonment.
Sure.
I mean, you're absolutely correct.
Right.
I felt abandoned. I mean, for the first time in my life, finally I met somebody. He was a school teacher from Montana, a cowboy. You know what I mean? He and I were just
sounds wonderful.
You know what I mean? we were a couple, and so it was very interesting. But while I was at the hospital, something happened to me, and I've said this now for 38 years, since the founding of Metropolitan Community Church, on national television shows all over the world. Everywhere I go, when they asked about it, I tell them that once they got me to the hospital, a woman walked in, an African-American woman in a nurse's uniform, but she had a magazine, some news magazine. I can't even tell you what it was, just enough to get my attention. And she said, the doctor will be here in a minute. But she said, why have you done this? She said, you're too young for this. She said, my goodness, isn't there somebody you can talk to? Can't you just look up? She pushed every button on me from my religious background. And I broke down crying all over again, and she left the room. And when she did, I prayed. And I said, God, I do want to ask forgiveness. I have committed the sin in Romans 1:26 through 28. Not the sin of homosexuality, but the sin of I turned my partner into God. And all at once, when God has clay feet, here I am in this mess, and I ask forgiveness for that. I ask forgiveness for this mess. And we Christians sometimes talk about the joy of our salvation. And for me, there for a minute, I felt so good all over again. And yet, it wasn't till the next morning. Well, the doctor, I've got to tell you, walked in first, and he was not nice. He started stitching up my wrists on both of my hands, and he was the Dutch uncle. And he said, do I need to lock you up for 72 hours, or are you going to be okay? I said, well, what do you think? He said, I think you need your ass kicked all over the hospital. That's what I think. But he says, you tell me. You're responsible for your life. I'm not. He said, you tell me. Life is about choices. He said, you tell me, are you going to be all right or not? And I said, no, I'm going to be all right. And Willie Smith, whose home it was with me, he was my best friend. We were never sexual partners. We were not lovers, but my best friend. It was amazing. We ended up in a situation where we lived, and he took me home and he asked me, are you going to be okay tonight? And I said, yes, I'm going to be. Well, next morning, before he leaves, he said to me, he was a projectionist here in Hollywood, and he said, are you going to be okay, or do I need to take off? I said, nope, going to be all right. And while I was laying in bed, Sheila, something happened to me. I immediately started thinking, oh my God, now I've got to pay my bills. I didn't die. I've got to, what about my job? Oh my God, I've got to get long sleeve shirts. I've got to hide this. They would fire me.
Totally inconvenient.
Totally.
But thinking about the future.
But thinking about the future.
Right.
But something happened then. All at once I'm laying there, I'm thinking about what had happened. You replay it again in your head. And the night before. And all at once I remembered that woman with that magazine in my prayer. And I all at once felt that wonderful joy again. And then it dawned on me. And I said, God, this can't be you. You can't love me. I'm still a homosexual. That hasn't changed. And the church has taught me you can't love me. And with that, I tell people all these years later that God spoke to me in a still small voice in my mind's ear and said to me, Troy, don't tell me what I can and can't do. I love you. You're my son, and I don't have stepsons and daughters. And with that, I knew without a shadow of a doubt God loved me, but I'm a practicing homosexual.
Well, that brings tears to my eyes, because I think the moment, there's a moment, or two or three if we're lucky, in our lives where we really do understand
Yes.
And it doesn't even always stay.
That's right.
You know, there's a moment of clarity.
A very,
and, you know,
very
I think it's
moment
what
of
people
clarity.
mean when they say God doesn't make any mistakes.
That's right.
When you say,
that's
I
right.
have
God
no
doesn't
stepsons or
create
stepdaughters.
garbage, as we always say in MCC
Exactly.
when we have to fight the religious right.
Right.
But for me, it was the most pivotal moment of my life. I've been invited to the White House, all kinds of things, but this event in my life so changed me. And the next thing that happened was I start dating somebody, but then I start thinking, oh my God, you know, and I'm trying to go to church again. Can't find any place to go to church. Well, I start dating, and I date a young Hispanic man. We go to a gay bar in Wilmington, California, first gay dance bar in the city of LA, and my God, go there one night, and he walks the bar, purchases both beers, brings me back mine. The police come over and arrest him, and my best friend for lewd lascivious conduct. One had slapped the other one on the rump, that was the crime, while they were telling a joke because it was so funny. And it
Now,
took
what
me,
part of the century are we talking about here?
You're now talking about early 1968.
Right.
And here I am all at once in a situation of where when I get this young man home, after I bail him out of jail and we bail out, a group of us went to the Harbor Division of the LAPD, scared him to death. The owner of the bar walked in and says, we're here to bail our sisters out of jail. And I was just taken back. I mean, that's not how I would have talked. And they said, what's your sister's name? Bill Hastings and Tony Valdez. And it was, we got them to, they kept losing them in the system. Back then our police department was one of the worst in the nation. And when we got him bailed out of jail, Tony said to me when I got him back to the house, I'm trying to talk to him. And he broke down just crying, and he said, I've never been treated this way in my life. And he said, the police officer said to me, he says, he spoke in Spanish to me and told me, I'm going to call your employers and your family. I'm going to tell them all about you. And he said, they're probably going to make me lose. I said, Tony, he's bluffing you. I said, he's not going to call your employers, and he's certainly not going to call your parents. Well, I'm not so sure of it. If there's anything I've learned from this experience, nobody cares about a queer. That's the word he used. And I said, Tony, I said, even if I believe that people don't care, and I don't believe that, but even if I did, God cares. Now, all at once, I'm a Christian again. And so I want to start talking to people about that.
And a little preaching, too.
A little preaching. And so he says, no, Troy, God doesn't care about me. I went to my priest when I was 15 years old. I told him how I felt, and he ordered me out of Catholic Sunday school. He was afraid I would contaminate other children. He said, no, Troy, God doesn't care about me. And he said, would you take me home? I took him home, came back, replayed what he said in my head, went up to my bedroom and knelt down and prayed. And I said, God, you know something? I've got a revelation here. I said, there must be people like Tony. I've tried to go to church and I can't find any place to go. You call me to preach. Now, I've always been taught you knew me in my mother's womb. You told me you loved me, not in spite of my homosexuality, but you loved me. I was your son. Now, if you love me, you must love other people. That was the revelation for me, that then God had to love other gay people. And I said, Lord, I said, maybe you call me to preach, and I've been preaching, and I'm so hungry. I said, maybe I need to just start a church. There must be people like me out there. I said, and just let me know when, if this is your will. Small voice in the mind's ear again, now. And with that, went to the bar owner and said, do you know anything about this gay newspaper, The Advocate, that they throw away here, you know, and there's 4 pages in it. And he said, yes. He said, I do. They're coming right now. He said, to meet with me. I have to renew my ads with him. I said, then I want to talk to him. And so when Dick Michaels and Bill Rand, the names they used at that time, they didn't use their real names. Right. It was amazing to me. When I came in, they were just immediately, their idea of religion, I don't know what it was, but they were not interested in selling me an ad. And they said, why? There's a lot of charlatans in the gay community. I said, tell us why. Well, I just testified to them. After about 30 minutes, they said, look, we'll give you the first ad if you'll buy 2 more.
Stop.
If you'll stop. And I said, absolutely. And the bar owner permitted me, as people were leaving, I had an ad here, Reverend Troy Perry, and a photograph of me. And it was very, very interesting. The ad came out in the Advocate, and here Reverend Troy Perry gave my home address in Huntington Park, California. Wow. Went home and my roommate had a heart attack, Willie Smith. You mean you have taken out an ad in a gay newspaper with our home address? He said, you are the craziest, why this religious thing you're so caught up in? He said, nobody cares. Willie said, at first I just couldn't get through to what Troy was trying to say. He said, why would any gay person want to go to a religious group, to a church? Mm-hmm. Why would they want to go? He said, all of us have had problems with religion. I said, I don't know. But I said, God has called me to do this thing, and I'm going to do it.
Do you think it's interesting that so many of these organizations started in L.A.?
You know,
I mean, we did, as you said, we gravitated to the large cities, and that is one of the reasons. We gravitated to the coasts. That's another reason. I mean, certainly there was the ability to stay alive instead of, getting killed. But still, L.A. seemed to be such a creative place for so many of our organizations.
I think it was Hollywood, movies. I think it was World War II. I think all those gay males who came through here being shipped out to the Pacific ended up coming back through here when they were let out of service, and they looked around and thought, I need to be here. Mm-hmm. I sometimes say that I learned very quickly in California because we had some of the first demonstrations here too. Right. I led demonstrations downtown before Stonewall. Right. And people don't get it sometimes that here it was easier being gay in this regard. I wasn't near my family. Right. And mom and dad, mom and my stepfather had left and gone back east, and so it's just different. And I think, like you said, there are creative people here. Some of those early people were writers in the movie industry, television, all of those. And this is a city that where people could come, where you could be an individual, even though you couldn't be a homosexual. They view it. People do it a little differently in California. Right. And so for me, this has been one of the most creative places in the world. I tell people that after I founded MCC, in 1973, I was named to our Human Rights Commission for the County of Los Angeles. Within 4 months, we added sexual orientation to our county charter by a vote. And it was done without, we had the votes there. It was done unanimously.
Did you find some resistance in the gay community to actually trusting a place of religion? It was so welcoming, and people seemed so, I'm going to use the word relieved yes. to find a place where they could be whole, instead of parking your religion over here so that you could be gay over here.
I've heard this story over and over again from people. They said the first time we heard about a gay minister, a homosexual pastoring a church, we said, this is some queen playing church. That was the first reaction. Mm-hmm. And people who came and drove around the building wanting to see what they looked like, the people attending church. They drove around the building once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, and then got up the nerve because they kept looking and they kept saying, well, that can't be the crowd. They don't, quote, look like the stereotype of gay people, because we were serious. All of us wore suits when we first started, sure. And all the women wore dresses. Then, as we went on, we didn't care. We said to people, we don't care where you wear cotton, linen, or lace, or leather. You're all welcome here. And I meant that. And people have told me who never joined MCC that they used to come. One man described it as the most elegant, he said, service I'd ever seen in my life. Mm. He said, you're an incredible speaker. And he said, your choir in robes said, and you'd bought that building down at 22nd and Union with the balcony, 2 auditoriums in the balcony, and it was packed to the rafters. And he said, there was just something about Sunday morning, he says, going there that was just incredible. And he said, you were just 2 things. And he had heard me say this. He said, remember what you said in a sermon one time? I was faithful and I was fearless. Those are the 2 things that I tell our church we have to be. I said, those are the 2 things we have to remember. Faithful, be true to ourselves, whatever we be, true to God, true to what we believe, but be fearless. nobody's going to stop us from doing the work we need to do to make this country different and then the world different. And of course, in my 36 years of being moderator of our denomination, thank God I was both of those things. And the things that really upset me was when people murdered people in my denomination. To this day, I think there's something about seeing people who believe what you say and die believing that, but are martyrs to our movement.
Tell me a little more about that, Troy. I know it's difficult, but I think it's important for people to know. I don't think people know that your churches have been burned down. I don't think people know that your congregants have been, murdered.
I always tell people that God had spoke to me and let me know I was to move to really be full-time with my denomination. So I announced in the LA church, I said, I won't be pastor here anymore. I want to build the denomination. I want to make sure that it grows too. We've got all these churches that are coming in, and I need to do that. And I remember that in 1973, January of 1973, in December, I announced in 72, that would be my last year with the church. I believe in giving people, they knew, I gave them a notice, that, and January of that year, our LA church burned down to the ground here. And, I always look back to that as the start of problems. And we went through a real period. Next one was Nashville, Tennessee. Our church was arson, burned down there. Somebody set the fire on church in San Francisco, California, and then wrote, "You will die," with an arrow at the pastor. And I flew up as I always did. It was very interesting. Dianne Feinstein, she and her first husband came to us, and she was, she was on the board of supervisors then, not the mayor of the city. Right. And she, that wonderful Jewish woman, and her Jewish husband donated the first money for us to buy a building in San Francisco. And the real thing that came up was finally on Gay Pride Sunday. I'm at the beach, 800 of us out doing our wiener roast and feeding everybody out there. And that night the police helicopter came along. We're all there because we're still singing and all. And they come in the fire when they tell us to leave the beach. And we waved at them, and we did. I said the benediction, we left. I went to hear gospel singers at a gay bar here in West Hollywood. A first that no gay bar had ever had a gospel group, so I wanted to be supportive. And then I get home, and there's a note on my door. It says, "You have to call." Reverend John Gill said, the district coordinator, "It's an emergency, something about a fire in New Orleans." Mm-hmm. And when I got into my home, the phones were ringing off the wall. Mm-hmm. And I got to my phones, and immediately someone called and said, "There's been a bad fire." It was John. He just kept calling. Mm-hmm. And I said, "What's wrong?" And he said, "There's been a fire in New Orleans. There are 32 people dead." Mm. And I said, 32 people died. And he said, "Yes, and it's 12 members of our church. They were in this gay bar. A man had donated an air conditioner, and they were there to accept the gift. And they had used this bar. They had a little theater in it for worship service, but they had just got their own little place to worship over on Joanne Street in the city." Mm-hmm. And immediately they said, I said, "How bad is it? Who?" I said, "What about the pastor?" And he said, "He's dead." Mm-hmm. And the assistant pastor and his partner died in the fire too. They had left their kids at a theater to see Disney films like people used to do in the South 100 years ago. Sure. And kids were safe. Everybody looked after everybody's kids. And they were both part of that. And I flew into the city. And the one thing, the police, before I could get there, said this was a place where thieves, burglars, and queers. And we can't find out who they are because, you know what I mean, they don't carry IDs. Well, by the time I hit the town, I immediately found out what the truth was. And I called the FBI office, and the FBI had been called in, and they had removed, the only thing left were the jawbones of people. The bones were seared to the floor. It was the most awful fire. Most of them had died of smoke inhalation, but our pastor had died hanging out the window. And
That's terrible.
It was just awful. And to end this, I tried to get a place to hold a memorial service, and I couldn't until finally, thank God, somebody said, have you tried St. Mark's Methodist Church? And so they have a black pastor with all white women on their board. And I went over there, and they let us use their property. But the awful part was fighting with the gay community. The gay business owners in the Vieux Carré on Bourbon Street came to town and said to me, why are you holding these press conferences, etc.? It scared them to death because I was putting spotlight on them. Morris Kite was with me. Marty Manford from New York City flew in, and then John Gill, our pastor, and another Paul Britton, who is a pastor of the New York City church, but worked for Social Security, so he knew how it all worked. And it was the first time ever that the gay community, the Advocate, we were able to raise money to bury all the bodies, but the city refused to let us bury the 3 people who they couldn't find their identification. And they insisted on burying them in a pauper's grave. And
let me ask you, because time runs so short, and it goes by so fast,
Yes.
and it does in life and it does in this show as well. And I think through the course of talking to you about your life and the founding of the church and the ups and the downs,
Yes.
which there have been and I
Yes.
assume will be, I just want to ask you a sort of an obvious question, but just since there's only a few minutes remaining to close the show, was it all worth it?
Absolutely. I tell people today that there are few regrets, that I would have done things a little differently. That's human nature. We all do it. But I'll tell you, I wouldn't change my life with anything in the world. The bad times, the good times. I remember the good times. I also remember the bad times, but those don't play up front in my life. I want to remember the good times.
You've touched so many people's lives. I mean, people you don't even know, as I'm sure you've recognized. The church has grown and grown and grown. It's such a welcoming organization, a welcoming church. Certainly not just gay people going to MCC Church.
No, that's true. Heterosexuals too.
Everybody of every stripe.
Right across that's right.
I think you've done more than many people I know to sort of cause that convergence of God and gayness.
Yes.
That has given us all, I think, a lot of hope. Are you still doing your work? It's not really a retirement, is it, Troy?
I'm still doing my work.
Yeah.
I've made it my business to go out of the U.S. In every country I visit now, I visit with local gay groups to encourage them. I visit with politicians. Everybody, I was to meet with the president of Brazil, but at the last minute he couldn't see me, but I met with cabinet members.
That's Lula's loss, I'd say.
That you know what I mean? It is, I continue to do it. And this year, Philip and I are going to China, and I plan to meet with the gays and lesbians while I'm there, and try to meet. I don't mind this. have never been a communist basher. I don't get caught up in that nonsense. And mine is to see if I can meet with politicians too there. And luckily, the title bishop opens a lot of doors for me to get in and visit with a lot of people all over the world.
Well, it's been wonderful talking to you. It's, as I said, you're an inspiration, certainly to me, and I think to so many people in the world. Thank you very much for joining us and for listening in. As Reverend Troy Perry talks about his life. And I guess the main lesson for me is the sort of the ability to be united, to be whole as an individual, and to get used to it.